Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Thursday afternoon, February 15th. It's been a while since we had an episode. We talked early last week with Dylan Burkhart of Hoops about Indiana and Michigan, some of the problems with both of those programs. Since then, Indiana, obviously, with a really impressive come-from-behind win at Ohio State, and then over the weekend, obviously, as we know, tough loss at Purdue, not totally unexpected, and now Indiana's had this week off. With a chance to get some extra time to prepare for Northwestern. I'm not sure exactly how much we'll talk about that matchup specifically, but Tony Adragna of the Assembly Call and the author of the great film room over there as a part of their community is back on Podcast on the Brink. Tony, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Always a pleasure being on Podcast on the Brink, so appreciate you having me on.
So I'm just kind of curious, obviously, You wear a little bit of a different hat than I do in terms of covering IU basketball. More of a, obviously, I don't root against IU basketball. It's great for business when they win, but as more of a straight media member, kind of have to toe the line on some things and how I cover the team. But you're not shy about your fandom. Obviously, you've been somebody that's followed the program for a long time, and you have a lot of great opinions and do a lot of great work with your film work. I'm just kind of curious to kind of get your pulse on, obviously I kind of maybe know where this is going a little bit, but from some of your tweets, but just your pulse on kind of where the season is right now in terms of what you expected going in and how maybe we got here where, 24 games into the season, Indiana at 14-10, how did we get to this point?
Sure. Yeah. And, appreciate the kind words as well. As you mentioned, at the end of the day, I'm an IU basketball I'm just an IU fan in general. That I happen to also have coached basketball, and so I can look at the game at a little bit of a deeper level, I would hope or think, than like a common fan. And that's not like a knock on the common fan. It's just that I have to watch film like when my team plays and whatnot, so I can just look at it with more of a critical eye, and sometimes that's for better or for worse. And with Indiana this season, what I was expecting going into it, I thought it was a low floor, high ceiling team. Like, I knew they had a lot of different pieces coming in. They were losing a lot from last season. And that's why I knew there was probably going to be a large variance in what the team could do. Now, with that said, they brought in a lot of talent. And, in Cloer and Mackenzie Mbako, then also you were bringing in Gabe Cupps, who is a highly regarded guard. And then, you got Malik Renew coming back. You've got Xavier Johnson, you think, coming back. And then, obviously another year of Trey Galloway. So that's why I put a high ceiling on there as well. I think at some point I made a prediction that I thought there would be struggles in like November, December, and by February, March, I thought the team would really be rounding into form because they'd have time to gel together, things like that. Obviously, that's not coming to fruition. The struggles in December, November have come to fruition, but they continue to struggle. And for me, my expectation from like an X's and O's standpoint is I expected a different look offensively, specifically for Indiana. I thought they were going to open the floor up more. I thought more ball screen stuff. And really kind of get away from throw it inside, everybody stand around the perimeter, maybe cut a guy through. And, that's what they did with Trayce Jackson-Davis. Trayce Jackson-Davis, make no doubt about it, was probably from December on last year the best player in the country. Like, I would go up against anybody and say he was a more important piece than even Zach Edey at certain points last season. So they lost him, and obviously that's a big one. But to then just kind of run it back and do the same thing that you did with Trayce Jackson-Davis and expect the exact same results, like, that's kind of crazy. He was the best player in college basketball, or at least one of the best too. So that's where my disappointment has been primarily, is just that, like, there hasn't been a different look. A lot of the things are the same. And kind of what Mike Woodson had told us was like, look, I'm going to take what I've got and I'm going to adapt around that. And maybe that is what he's doing. Maybe that is the best case scenario, is throwing it to Malik Renew. But it's not been a lot of fun to watch. The metrics don't say that it's a great way to play. Pounding it inside, and even on when they do ball screen stuff, a lot of the shots end up in that mid range shot that is analytically speaking the worst shot in basketball. So it's just been a little bit tough. Obviously, I think I share a lot of the same sentiments as other fans in terms of where the expectations were and where they're at. And it's not even so much the 14-10 that bothers me a little bit. It's the way they're 14-10, squeaking by some mid-major or even low-major teams, getting the doors blown off of them by several of the top teams that they've played against. So it's like it's not even necessarily the 14-10. It's not like the Michigan State 14-9 or whatever that is, where like that's seen as a struggle, but they're still like squarely in the field of 68. It's like a 14-10 where Kid and Palm top 100 barely, not even close to the bubble. That's where it's kind of like, man, like the wheels have really kind of fallen off this thing.
So one thing I've kind of been thinking about since late November, early December, kind of when we had a little bit more data on this team, like playing some games. I haven't talked about it on the podcast, but we're to the point now of the season where I kind of feel it's worth discussing, and I want to get your thoughts on it. When I kind of look at this roster and where Indiana is now, I think there's an argument to be made that Indiana was kind of set up to fail before the season even started with the roster construction. I know that's kind of been a word that's been tossed around a lot on social media and people talking about roster construction, but getting into it a little bit more specifically, betting as much as they did on Xavier Johnson when, the first year, obviously he had some ups and downs, but was great at times. But there was also, people like to reference that stretch and at the end of the season, the Big Ten tournament and, getting them into the NCAA tournament ultimately. But there was also a game, if you can remember back to against Wisconsin early in that season where Indiana had a huge lead on the road at the Kohl Center and Indiana completely fell apart. And Mike Woodson sent Xavier Johnson out as the only player to answer questions from the media. So it's not like Xavier Johnson was this surefire guy that you could count on. Plus, he was coming off an injury last season. You didn't really know where he was at. And then you just kind of look at the rest of the guard rotation and kind of the pieces that Indiana assembled. Maybe we should have scrutinized this more when the roster was being put together, but you look back on it now in hindsight, you say, what were they really thinking in terms of the guards and having to put so much on the shoulders of Gabe Cupps, who clearly is not ready to play the number of minutes that he's been playing. Ja'Kai Newton, I'm sure they knew at some point in the offseason and going back to the last high school season that there was a chance he wasn't going to be fully healthy. Trey Galloway is, in my opinion, on a good team, a sixth, seventh man. And then CJ Gunn was largely unproven last year in terms of his 3-point shooting. The numbers were really bad. And, I think maybe betting on him to have a breakthrough was a little bit optimistic. So obviously we have the benefit of hindsight now, but that's kind of what we do, as people that analyze and talk about sports. I mean, do you think there's an argument to be made that Indiana in many ways the season was kind of lost before it even began, just in terms of how this team was put together and maybe the way that they neglected, I think, to, they have a roster spot open. They added Anthony Walker and Peyton Sparks, who maybe you take one of those guys, but I don't, how much different would it look if Indiana had, an experienced guard that was 6'2" or 6'3" that could handle the ball and hit some 3-pointers and play make for other guys than what they have.
Yeah. And it just kind of seems like a haphazard construction. Not like what you want to do. And I'm not like speaking to Mike Woodson, obviously, but like as a basketball program that is able to like recruit players, you want to figure out what is our identity going to be? What are we going to hang our hat on each and every single night? And then you recruit to that. With Indiana, it kind of seems like, how much talent can we accumulate? Let's figure this thing out, and then we'll, go from there. And like, because on paper, like we mentioned, their starting lineup has more stars in it than any other starting lineup that is probably in the Big Ten. But as we know, that doesn't mean much. You could go Purdue 1 through 5 and IU 1 through 5, and every single IU guy has more stars next to their name than Purdue. With that said, the construction of it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think you made a great point about Trey Galloway. A lot of people are like, man, he made such a big jump last year. Like, how could he regress so much? And it's because the load that he's expected to take, the usage that is expected of him is vastly greater than it was last year. Last year, he was a spot up shooter that could create off the dribble at times in certain actions, usually coming off of Trace Jackson Davis, where the defense was focused on Trace. Spot up shooting. Team would double, ball would get swung, his feet are set. He knocked it down at a 40-some% clip. Well, now this season, he's not only is he being asked sometimes to be the lead guard that creates his own shot for others, he's also being tasked with oftentimes guarding the other team's best lead guard. So he's tired, he's exhausted having to do that. Like that to me is like when you just put Gabe Cupps on the other team's best player and figure it out. Like I think that's where Gabe is better right now than anywhere is on the defensive end. So to me, with a guy like Trey, he's just asked to do way too much for his skill set, and that kind of comes down to the construction of the roster. It's like, okay, well, if it's not Trey leading the charge at guard, then who is it right now? Well, nobody. Trey is the only one, and every once in a while he'll catch lightning in a bottle and he'll drop a 25-point game or whatever the case is. But more times than not, his numbers, he is what his numbers say he is. Like he's not a great shooter. He turns the ball over a little bit, and he's, like you said, he's a good player, solid player, but not somebody that you want leading a team that you have high aspirations for. And so I'm with you on the roster construction. Probably should have critiqued it more at the time that it was happening. I think we all kind of were like, okay, like you could nod your head along and be like, I can see it. Like if Xavier Johnson takes that step, if Trey Galloway maintains what he did, Mackenzie Mbako is a McDonald's All-American. Like he's going to be good. Malik Renew, 5-star recruit, he's going to be good. Khalil Ware, like that guy's so good. Like so you start talking yourself into it a little bit. And then when it gets on the floor, I mean, literally from game one, that group has struggled. Not necessarily that group, but the Indiana University basketball team has struggled. Like from this tip, Florida Gulf Coast was a nail biter, Army was a nail biter, and they just have not really put it together. And that it has to come down to something, right? So is it the roster construction? Is it the scheme? Is it something else? Is it the cohesion of the team? Is it the locker room? Like there's something that's not right due to the accumulation of the talent that's there. What is it? And roster construction is typically where we're leaning right now.
Yeah, and also, I want to get into just kind of the scheme, the coaching, whatever you want to call it. There's been some things, obviously, throughout the season that people have looked at and kind of put under a microscope. All of the long twos was a thing there for a while and on social media, and I still think they continue to take that shot pretty regularly within games. The substitution patterns, which, were also dissected for a long time, and it seemed like there was certain times where it's kind of been adjusted, and then you had, the auto benching for the 2 fouls. It was like the first Purdue game where Mike Woodson really, I think for the first time as Indiana's coach, kind of second guessed himself in a press conference and said, I shouldn't have done that. It was I don't really recall him doing that in his first couple of years. He's always been pretty steadfast in kind of his belief. And so, I think when all of these things kind of get thrown together in the pot and you kind of watch now, we've got a pretty good body of work with this team. I think people start to kind of question Mike Woodson in terms of his coaching and what he's, maybe his, I don't want to say lack of understanding of the college game, but maybe not adjusting to kind of what the college game is compared to the NBA. It seems like, he'll even now say, we're still learning each other. We're still getting together. And it's like, all right, it's middle of February. We're less than 4 weeks away from the Big Ten tournament. Like this isn't really the time to be learning. This is the time to kind of, I don't want to say you want to peak at this time, but like you're getting ready to put your foot on the gas pedal and say, this is what we have. And we're going to go out and kind of go from here and make a run. And so I think it's, what I'm hearing a lot from people in our community, and I'm sure with the Discord channel that you guys have over at Assembly Call, it's the same thing. People are questioning, this is year 3. Things aren't really headed in the right direction. What can we expect going forward? Because when you get to this point in a season like this, and people realize that there's no realistic path to the NCAA tournament other than winning the Big Ten tournament or like winning out and winning a couple games, which are both extremely unlikely, people start to point towards the future and they want to think about next season and the portal's opening here in a couple weeks and all that discussion. But you know what what has been your impression just in terms of Woodson's kind of ability to adapt to the college game? What maybe is missing from that? And do you think a lot of those critiques are fair things that that people are bringing up, like the substitution thing, the auto benching with 2 fouls, talking about this point of the season, we still need to we're still learning each other and those kind of things. It just feels like those would be things like maybe you say in the middle of an NBA season, like when you're trying to figure things out, or the other night I think after Purdue he said we need to add some pieces. It's like I assume he meant for next season, but because no pieces are being added at this point. And I think, those things that are said, IU fans, they hang on every word, right? Nothing is going to get past them. If something's said in a press conference and we post it on the YouTube channel, there's immediately comments in the below or on the site, and nothing gets past any comment. So that's another thing that people just pick up on, and they start scratching their head. Like some of these things are just kind of hard to explain. So, I'm just kind of curious where you are just in terms of Woodson, in terms of how he's been able to adjust to the college game.
Yeah, I guess like in one word is frustrated. It's been like you mentioned, it's year 3 now. Like those adjustments to the college game should have taken place by now. Like even to your point of the large losses that you mentioned in your community today, several losses by 15 plus points. Like to me, that's almost an NBA mindset of like, don't have it tonight, phone it in, we'll get the next one. Well, it's not an 82 game season anymore. You're 30 some games. And, I noted that this week in one of my pieces is Indiana has absolutely tanked their metrics. And specifically like your KenPom metrics. Indiana has a far better record than several teams that are above them in KenPom, but KenPom is a predictive metric based on your efficiency. Well, when you barely beat number 330 in the country, and then you lose by 30 to number 10 in the country, like those are not good for your KenPom metrics. So that is an aspect of the selection committee is, metrics, whether it be the net, KenPom, all that good stuff. Like obviously quad 1, quad 2, quad 3 wins, all those things are going to be your most important thing. Winning is the absolute most important thing. But there are ways you can maximize what you're doing in terms of the metrics. Like I mentioned, Michigan State, they have a very similar record to Indiana. They're squarely in the field currently. And that's because, they've beaten a couple good teams. If they lose, it's not by 30 points. They took care of business for the most part against the teams that they should have taken care of business against. And Indiana just didn't do that. And so it's like in some of these games where they lose by 20 points and, I don't want to, we do hang on every word and we hang on every movement. And you look at the bench and those blowout losses and Mike Woodson's taking a seat with 6 minutes left. He's no longer even standing up coaching. Like if you're the player, even if you have the starters in, you're like, all right, coach gave up. Like, what's the point here? So those little things, when you add them all up, the 2-bench auto sub, he actually, like you said, critiqued himself and said, like, man, I don't know if I should have done that against Purdue. So I'm like, all right, good. Well, he's learned his lesson there. They play Purdue again. Khalil Ware gets 2 fouls, immediately gets auto benched, and the wheels kind of fell off from there. He ended the game with 2 fouls. He averages 2.1 fouls per 40 minutes. Like those are things that it's like, if us as fans recognize and understand, first off, you think like surely the head coach of the program understands that, and then if he does understand it, it's like, why isn't that being applied? And that's where the frustration lies, because it is year 3. This is like the year where, for the most part, if your program's taking a jump and like you're under a new regime, like year 3 is where you kind of get it rolling. And, you can say everything you need to say or want to say about, yes, they lost a lot last year. They certainly did. But Mike Woodson is handsomely paid to figure those things out. He is handsomely paid. He has a top recruiting budget. He has one of the top 10 NIL budgets. Like, it's never been easier to win at Indiana than it is right now. Outside of, back in the Bobby Knight days when he could recruit basically anybody he wanted to recruit and get those guys in. But in the modern era of college basketball in the 21st century, it's as easy as it's ever been to win at Indiana. And to be this far behind, that's where the anxiety happens, because thankfully the portal exists, because you look to 2024 and Indiana has one recruit committed and Liam McNeely, which his skill set helps solve a lot of Indiana's problems. But as you move forward and you look at some of these things, I get why there's some anxiety here about what this staff is doing, because there's talk about like, well, we just haven't been able to gel. We got a lot of new guys in here. Well, you're going to lose Khalil Ware to the draft. Who knows what's going to happen in Baco? And then you've got some other, obviously you're losing Xavier Johnson. Then you've got, your Galloways and your Leals who could take another year. But like, you went out and said you got to get new pieces. You said it in the press conference. You need more faces. Well, does that mean you're going to take till mid-February next season to kind of gel together? Those are the things that cause anxiety, and I get it.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, like, you can say that maybe this year specifically and get away with it once, but it's not like Indiana is the only program that lost a lot from last season and is trying to replace. There's plenty of programs you look around the country that have lost important players that have still, it's the programs that year in, year out are good that don't really ever take a step back. And it's because they have coaches that kind of understand the system and understand like what they need on a year-to-year basis. And I know that a lot of coaches are still kind of trying to learn the portal and the best kind of setup in terms of how many high school recruits to take in a year and then what you want to get from the portal. And honestly, I don't hate the fact that Indiana only has one player signed for next year, because it gives them the flexibility depending on also who enters the portal. With a good portal season, all of a sudden you bring in, 4 or 5 guys and your team looks totally different and you can change the narrative. The problem though is you've now put so much pressure on that happening that if it doesn't happen, you could be in a really dire situation, and players on the current roster are going to need to see something pretty quickly in the portal to kind of give them reinforcement, like, okay, it's going to be better next year because coach is bringing in X, Y, and Z, and I can see a path to us being better. Otherwise, there's no guarantee that your best players are going to come back, because they could say they can see the same thing that everybody else sees and says, well, you know what? We're only bringing in McNeely. We got this one guy from the portal, but other than that, it's, we're bringing in some guys that maybe aren't going to be as high impact, and I don't really see a path for us being much better. Well, I'm going to go somewhere else where, they're going to give me kind of similar money and I have a better chance to make the NCAA tournament. So I think the part of the anxiety too kind of stems from the fact that, they did go out, get Khalil Ware in the portal last spring. That was a great get, right? He's one of the best highly coveted guys. But other than that, I mean, Anthony Walker was an okay ad, and Peyton Sparks to this point. I mean, nothing against Peyton Sparks, has not been a positive addition to the program. And they got nothing from the guard or wing position in the portal that was impact last year. And so people are looking at that and say, so we whiffed completely on the portal last year in terms of guards and wings. And now all of a sudden we're expected to go get 2 or 3 of these guys and they're going to come. I mean, maybe you can look at the potential NIL money that they could have to spend, and maybe that gets them a guy or 2. But I think, kind of building on what you said there, I think a lot of people's questions just kind of come down to like, what's going to make next year better? And we really don't have the answers to that, but we can also kind of, all we can go on is what's happened in the past, and there's not necessarily the greatest track record in terms of what they've been able to bring in.
That, and the more and more that Indiana's not really able to showcase a wing doing things, the harder and harder you're going to get recruited negatively against, because all these top guys that enter the portal that Indiana's going to want, everybody's going to want, and everybody's going to be giving them sales pitches. And thankfully, Indiana's got the NIL funds that can, trump some of that. But there's a lot of negative recruiting that happens in these situations. And Indiana, like, what are you going to say if somebody says like, well, look how they showcase their wings. Look what this guy they showcased this year, his numbers.
I mean,
Look
even
at,
look at Miller Kopp. I mean, he's gone on to have a pretty nice season in the G League, and I mean, it seems to me like he wasn't. I mean, he was a solid player, but I don't feel like he was maximized. I mean, Hood Schifino obviously was a one and done. That's something you can look at and say that was maybe a really good development for Mike Woodson on the recruiting front, but it hasn't really translated into getting more guards. But sorry to interrupt, but I'm just saying like that was the first name
yeah,
that came to mind. Like Miller Kopp felt like to me like he was a pretty good get, but he was a role player who to me was underutilized.
yeah. I mean, and it gets talked about a lot more now that people are starting to jump more and more off the Woody train for better or for worse. Like, one of his first press conferences, he said, or not first, but one of his press conferences, he said, it's not my job to get Miller Kopp shots. Well, it's like, it actually is.
Yeah.
um, and so, and I think it's those little sound bites, like you said, nothing gets by Indiana fans. And then if there's a negative mindset, the fear, if I'm administration at Indiana, is that if there's another season that's remotely like this next year, it is going to be a cesspool of toxicity, like worse than it's been. Archie Miller got booed off the floor his last game as Indiana coach. Like it would reach levels of that if it's bad. And so like, I'm not saying like they have to weigh the decision, do you keep Mike Woodson or not because of that, but it's also like that staff, they have to knock it out of the park in the portal this offseason and put a good product on the floor next year, or you and I both know, and a lot of fans know, like it's going to get ugly. Like whether you say don't do it or not, like it's going to get ugly.
Yeah, one of the numbers that I posted today in the community, some of the numbers I was just looking at, because obviously the efficiency margin is a big reason why the metrics have tanked the way that they have, and you wrote a nice piece about that at the assembly call the other day. And the first season under Woodson, the average margin of loss was 9.2 points. Last year it was, to me, this is still too high given the talent that they had last year. 11.9 points is their average margin of defeat, which they had 2 games last year where they lost by 22 and another game where they lost by 19. It's like they have 2 players that are in the NBA right now. One who's actually been pretty good as a rookie, and the other one was a mid first round pick. That's a lot to be losing games by. And this year it's been 15.2 points per game is the average margin of loss. And that to me is just, 7 losses in 3 seasons, three seasons not completed yet, 7 by 20 or more, 15 by 15 or more, and then 20 double figure losses. Those are some hard numbers to swallow when you look at them.
Yeah, I actually looked at all the way back to Mike Davis, the percentage of games coached where your team lost by 15 or more, and we're looking at Mike Davis, who was fired, I believe, 4 or 5 seasons. Then you had Kelvin Sampson, Tom Crean, who for 3 years got the doors blown off him, it seemed like. Then Archie Miller, who never really got it going, and Mike Woodson. Mike Woodson has the most games percentage-wise coached that his team has lost by 15 or more of all of the coaches at Indiana, probably ever. Definitely Bob Knight didn't. And so at least since the 70s, he takes the cake for most 15-point losses in terms of percentages. And to me, that goes back to what I just said of how it's never been easier to win at Indiana. Like Mike Woodson has been afforded opportunities that even as recent as Archie Miller didn't have. In terms of having that NIL war chest that's top 10 in the country, like that's an absolute game changer. And, it kind of comes back to Shirley Donovan had even noted like what the Indiana job was looked at as nationally even when Mike Woodson was hired and what it's looked at nationally now, given what they've got in terms of NIL, it's a lot better looking job for people because they know they can win there. And so that's what the frustration for me lies. It's like all these people are saying like, this is such a good job. You can win here. You've got all these people that are willing to donate like their money to make these things happen. and the team is as bad as it's been since Tom Crean's second season in terms of KenPom. It's like, how does this happen? Like, 1+1's not equaling 2 here.
What do you, I mean, realistically, do you feel like there's a chance that Woodson could make some changes in the offseason that would, be beneficial or change the direction of things moving forward, or is that unrealistic to expect given kind of where he is in his career? And I'm not talking about like staff changes per se, but just in terms of like changes in approach. Are there small things that maybe he could tweak? We've seen this over. One of the examples I like to point at, and this is a guy that to me, top 3 coach in the Big Ten right now, Brad Underwood, when he came over to Illinois, those first couple seasons, he was married to the style of, we're gonna relentlessly pressure the ball and try to cause all these turnovers, and it was a train wreck the first 2 seasons, and now, and I think I talked about this a couple of podcasts back. To me, he's one of the guys that on a year-to-year basis does a great job and kind of like, all right, this is what I have on my roster, and I'm gonna try to throw all those ingredients in this big pot, and I'm going to mix it together, and like I'm going to come up with the best recipe for success. And like this year, if you remember back to Illinois last year, that they were playing Dane Danger a ton of minutes. Like he's like an afterthought now. They've gone with Coleman Hawkins at the 5, and they've got this lineup that's it's kind of weird. They're playing guys that are like between 6'6" and 6'9", and putting them at every spot, and they make you match up. And a lot of that's based on kind of what you're able to get out of the portal. But I think like the appetite from IU fans to see like another season of like, I think Woodson calls it buddy ball or whatever, but or they're running the 2 posts and not shooting a lot of threes, I think is pretty minimal. So like, what do you think? For I guess like a 2-parter. Do you think Woodson would be open or capable of kind of changing his approach and being open minded in terms of adjusting? And 2, like, what ideally would be a better approach in terms of style of play or small tweaks that can maybe yield some significant gains moving forward?
Sure. With Woodson, even looking back to his NBA days, he hasn't really made a lot of schematic changes unless his hand was absolutely forced to. Even this season, when you look at like against Illinois, when Ware wasn't available, they went with a little bit of a smaller lineup. They were able to spread the floor a little bit more, and they competed. Well, it's like Ware gets back, and immediately it's back to your buddy ball. And so, unfortunately, I'm not necessarily sure that wholesale changes would happen to the style of play unless Indiana struck out in the portal for somebody that they think would replace Kel'el Ware. I think they absolutely will play Malik Renew at the 4 if they can. And I think they're going to go after probably a center in the portal, if I had to guess.
Or Derek Queen, right?
Or Derek Queen, yeah. I mean, you're very possible you've got a Derek Queen, Malik Renew backcourt, which is going to be a lot of the same. And that's frustrating for most fans because even dating back to Archie, that's kind of how the program was run. You had the Joey Brunk, Trace Jackson Davis, you had Juwan Morgan types. So like even with Archie, you're looking at like 8 years of your 3-point rate being bottom 290 in the country. Like in every other metric, everything in the world is talking about how 3-pointers are changing the game, and teams are utilizing the 3-pointer at a rate not seen. And then like me as a Pacers fan, I watch the Pacers and they like shoot a ton of threes and make a ton of threes. They got the best offense in history of the NBA right now. And then your team does the complete opposite of what kind of conventional wisdom says. It's like, okay, then you better be really, really, really good at everything else if you're not going to maximize the 3-point line to your advantage. And Indiana's not. I talked about those 15-point losses and the percentage for Mike Woodson. Mike Weemuth went and extrapolated that and was like, all right, well, how much did Indiana get beat from the 3-point line in those defeats? And it averaged out to like 15.8 points or something like that they were outscored from the 3-point line, like almost the exact margin of defeat. And so it's just, if that's your system, okay, like, he's head coach. They're going to have a system that they're going to do. But if that's your system, like you better be really, really good at it. And they're just not. Like offensively, they're not a top 100 team in Ken Palm, I don't think. And
No, I mean,
defensively,
if you're gonna if the big part of your offense is get the ball inside and get fouled and go to the free throw line, you better be able to make free throws, right? That's kind of
yeah,
one of the things people that irks people, right?
yeah, in the Big Ten, they're shooting 63.9% from the free throw line. Like that's almost unheard of. Like you could, I'm not even saying this like jokingly. You could put a group of eighth graders out there and they could probably shoot better than that.
Yeah. It's I think the neglect of the 3-point line. It's fair to call it that at this point because it's not prioritized. And I think the other thing is it's kind of we've come full circle here, right? Because it was like Tom Crean was space the floor, shoot a ton of threes, maybe not defend as much. And people were like on board at the early stages of Archie of like, all right, we're gonna have this pack line defense and we're gonna lock people down. And there was moments where you could see like, all right, this could work. And there was other moments where it was like, well, it's obviously not gonna work. And then with Woodson, same thing. Like he comes in the first year and establishes this culture of defense, has the best defense to his credit in the Big Ten his first year in conference play in terms of points per possession allowed. And it's been on a steady decline. Even with more talent in year two, last year, his defense in the Big Ten was not as good. And so I agree with you. Like if you're going to have a system, I think you can win playing two bigs, but you better be elite defensively. And when you get to the line, you better make it. And they're neither of those.
And you better rebound the basketball.
Right. And that's the other thing. That's another thing I wanted to ask you about. It's like they're one of the tallest teams in the country, but they're average to below average at best rebounding. Is that, you've watched a lot of film? Like, can you put into words like what's going on rebounding on both ends of the court? I mean, I know some of offensive rebounding is how many guys you send to the glass because there's teams that by design like don't crash the offensive boards in favor of getting back on defense. Wisconsin, I think, is a team like historically that's kind of been like that. I don't know if they are this year, but I know a lot of years they've been like, well, we're not going to get beat in transition, so we're going to maybe send a guy to the glass, but other than that, we're getting back. But the defensive rebounding, I kind of thought early in the season it was like, well, these teams are taking all these threes, so there's some long rebounds and guys maybe are missing, but like they've had 24 games to figure this out. Why are they so bad rebounding on both ends?
I think it's a couple things. Obviously we're not in practice every day, so we don't know for certain, but usually if a team is really bad at something, it's because it's not prioritized. And I could be completely off base with that. And I want to add that caveat. I'm not saying Indiana doesn't prioritize deep rebounding, but the metrics would lead you to believe that it's not prioritized. I watched the film, and I think part of it too is that Indiana's guys on defense are out of position so often that when you're in bad defensive position, you're in bad rebounding position as well. And so if you're lost on the defensive end, if you're not in the correct position to mark up your guy, or you're in the help side defense, whatever the case may be, the offensive player has a better shot at getting the rebound. And I think that's a lot of what we see is just like the bad defensive positioning turns into bad rebounding positioning, and guys get good looks at getting the rebounds. And so that's a big part of it. The offensive rebounding, it does more so spell that Indiana's not getting, or Indiana pushes more guys back to not get beat in transition. That's a big part of Mike Woodson's defensive philosophy. But at some point, you got to ask, like, why? Why is that the strategy? Like, what are you trying to prevent in transition? Like, is that the payoff? Is that paying off of not sending those guys to the glass because you're not making a ton of shots? So why not try to get more possessions to push that? And so it's kind of one of those head scratchers because, like you mentioned, I think they're the fourth tallest team in terms of Ken Palm, like measuring the height. They start, Mbako and Ware and Renew at the 3, 4, and 5. Those are all three healthy size young men. Plus Galloway is also a long wing. Like the rebounding issues should not be what they are. And some of it, sure, bad luck, but at this point in the season, you're 24 games in, like you mentioned, and defensive rebounding wise, you're 236 in the country. Like that. I mean, and then if you look at like, okay, yeah. So if you look at like, okay, well, like who are the top rebounding teams in the country? And one of them is like Boston University, and they don't start a guy over 6'8". So it's like, all right, at some point it's got to be like, is it prioritized? Is it talked about in film? Like, there's a lot of questions I have because I'll watch it in film. I'm like, well, that guy didn't even think about blocking out, or that guy just turned around and never hit anybody. Like, at some point, the questions asked, like, you got to wonder because obviously something is not working for you to be that below average with the amount of size that you have.
Yeah, from a media perspective, and fans don't really care about like what about us in terms of like how we feel about things for the most part. But one of the frustrating things for me this season in particular has been like I've tried to ask some questions like along the way during the season of like, okay, like what, like particularly I think it was after maybe the Auburn game where they got blown out by 28, and I was kind of like, like kind of what do you work on like between that and the Kansas game, I believe it was, to try to get like back on track. And the answer was like very vanilla, like we just work. And I'm like, like Tom Izzo will talk about like, if they had a poor rebounding game, like we put on the football pads and we put like a thing over the rim where a shot's not going in, and like these guys just beat the hell out of each other until somebody gets a rebound. Where I think Mike Woodson could kind of help himself a little bit if he maybe explained things a little bit better. To, like I said, in many ways the media is an extension of the fan base. Like we're trying to get answers to give to the fan base, and when you ask those things and there's no real clear explanation, just kind of like what you said, we're not in practice. So if we're not going to be in practice, like at least like tell us, what you're working on. And there's a student I think last week or a week before kind of asked Woodson like just kind of like how he envisioned this team to look like before the season, like with the roster set up. And I thought it was a very fair question, and it was like didn't get like a clear like answer in terms of style play. And I think that's another part of the disconnect. It was like, in his introductory press conference, like this will stick in my head forever. He said the words 4 out, 1 in. And like, how many times does that actually happen? And it's like I said, I know if it's in my head, like I'm sure you remember it and other people that follow the program, like, nothing's getting past Indiana fans. And I think those things, like it's fine if you're winning. Like the last couple of years, I mean, the tournament people were happy. They're not going to dissect those things. But now that they're not, all of these things like have kind of come together, and you just have these list of grievances that people are like having a hard time like getting past.
Yeah, and he has gotten more and more snarky with you guys. I've noticed, like with some of the questions, or like you guys asked about the substitution patterns. And when I say you guys, I just mean like the media in general,
right?
And he eventually was like, "Guys, I'm not going to answer this again. It is what it is," and like that is a quick way to like turn people off. If somebody asks you a legitimate question and you kind of get snarky back, like people are going to be like, what the hell's his problem? Like, yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question. And so like, yeah, it's all these little things, like the optics of it. When you, on the surface, it's just like this little thing. But when you add all of those up, it's like, you can kind of see why there maybe are some macro issues people are concerned about. Because it's almost seems like tone deaf to not answer that with, I'm not saying give us every little detail, but like some genuine like detail of here's why that happened, or here's how that happened. Like there's never been like a deep level of talk, like of
just talking basketball,
like
right?
Exactly. Like even the conversation you and I are having right now, like there's never been that level with him where, and if somebody does ask him a question like that, like you noted, just kind of a vanilla answer. So even the nail slot rim stuff, like people have talked about that multiple times now. And I think it came out like because they had Trace Jackson Davis imitate Woody one time, and he kept talking about nail slot rim. And so we've kind of all just like surmised that that's their defensive philosophy is called nail slot rim, but we don't actually know that because he's never really like told us what nail slot rim is. And I'm not saying he has to tell us his entire defensive strategy, but it's just like there's no deep level of talk. It's all surface level stuff, which when you're losing, that gets frustrating from a fan base.
For sure. Last thing, kind of non-IU related before we wrap up this episode, just want to get your thoughts on what happened at Ohio State, obviously, yesterday. The dismissal of Chris Holtmann, who was famously a part of that 2017 hiring cycle that included Brad Underwood to Illinois, Archie Miller to Indiana, Chris Holtmann to Ohio State. Early on, it kind of looked like Holtmann was the cream of the crop of those three hires. Going to the tournament, I think 4 of his first 5 years, and I think the 1 year they didn't go was because it was canceled due to COVID, and had a really nice start there. And I think one thing that maybe hurt him a little bit was he never really took it out of the second round at Ohio State, and maybe didn't build up that kind of goodwill that maybe needed with the fan base, because there's an expectation kind of with what Thad Matta was able to do at Ohio State that they would at least be like a second weekend team consistently. I think if you were a second weekend team consistently, Ohio State, they're probably going to be pretty happy with that, because by that time of year, they're looking to spring football and not too much worried about the rest of the basketball season. But you surprised at all that Holtmann didn't work out at Ohio State, and just kind of curious your thoughts on, what they do from here. And obviously a lot of names have been tossed about, but I think it's kind of an underrated job, because you go in there with probably a pretty nice NIL budget, and you don't have the pressure of an Indiana or another school with a rabid fan base like Indiana, and you can go in there, and if you win a lot of games and, like I said, get to the second weekend consistently, people are happy for the most part.
I honestly quite shocked at how it took such a drastic turn for him.
Yeah.
Like you noted, they weren't like some powerhouse that was, beating the doors off of everybody, but they were a very solid program up till last season. Like you said, made the tournament every single year. They were recruiting well, seemed well liked, and then the wheels fell off last year. And then it was like, oh, they turned it around this year.
12-2.
Yeah, 12-2, and they had a big win to start beginning of the year again.
Beat Alabama.
Yeah. So it's like, oh wow, like last year was just a little blip on the radar, and then really, really took a turn for the worst. And then, I think Indiana might have actually sealed his fate. I know that he coached one more game, but if I'm on that side of things, where the coach kind of seems like he's on the hot seat, and then you blow an 18-point lead to another team that's struggling, like I can see that probably didn't sit well with a lot of people. So it does surprise me, though. I think Chris Holtmann is a good coach. I mean, it seemed like things were going in the right direction. He did well at Butler. He did well at Gardner-Webb. But ultimately, like you said, that hiring cycle, if you look at it from a national league too, Chris Mack was at Louisville. Like that hiring cycle just did not pan out, because I mean that was a big one. Like that was one where folks were like, man, like there's a lot on the line here for a lot of these programs. And the fact that Brad Underwood's the one that's kind of outlasted all of that is kind of bizarre.
He's thriving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's bizarre when you think about the names that were involved and how, Archie's now, he's on his second year at Rhode Island, right?
And they're not doing too hot. Second year.
Yeah, he took the year off. But yeah, and they're not very good. Like he's already on his second coaching job since that cycle, and then you've got Brad Underwood, who's just over here at Illinois. Has one of the top teams. I think I saw they're like 6th or 7th right now in terms of the odds to win the NCAA tournament in Vegas, which is kind of wild. But yeah, it's just I'm surprised that it came to this at Ohio State so quickly. I wouldn't have guessed that even to start the year of 2024, but it got ugly, and it got ugly in a hurry. And I think now their administration, they get a jump on, they can start putting out feelers, through intermediaries on anybody and everybody that they want, and they can make a decision quickly. And I think that does give them a leg up, because they think this is going to be a big hiring cycle. And so if they're the first ones to kind of strike, and I think that's ultimately why you probably saw the move in mid-February and not after the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, and there's not as much people. Some people on social media yesterday said, well, now their players can enter the portal, but the portal opens in like a month, unless these guys are going to just quit during the season and say, I'm not playing anymore, which is unlikely, because why would you do that? If someone's going to enter the portal, they're going to do it after the season. I know there's a window now open, but there's no real advantage to doing it. So I don't really think it hurts them either in that regard. And obviously they've got one of the assistant coaches taking over on an interim basis. So I think there'll at least be some continuity there in terms of the roster through the end of the year. And then who knows, you bring in the right guy. I think there's some pieces there that are definitely capable of helping you moving forward. And I think Jared tweeted yesterday, like, please don't get this hire right. And he's like, no, it's okay if you get it right. It's better for the Big Ten when Ohio State's good. But I think it's an opportunity, depending on who they were able to get in there, and if it's a good fit, I think they could definitely be a really good program once again. But and like you, I agree with you. I mean, I think Holtman was a pretty good coach. I wouldn't necessarily put him in like the great category, but I was always impressed with just kind of how he handled himself. And um, he'll be. I don't think he's going to be unemployed for long. Maybe he goes down a level to like a St. Louis or a DePaul or a Vanderbilt, one of those schools, depending on what opens. And I think he could be a great fit somewhere like that. So, Tony, it's always good to talk to you. If you want to, real quick, just kind of let everyone know where they can find the film room work, and kind of give a little plug for the assembly call stuff.
Sure. Yeah. As always, appreciate you having me on. Love chatting some college hoops and IU hoops, and specifically with you. Obviously this one was a little bit on my end, a little bit more negative than I would like to be, but it's also just kind of being real right now.
Yeah, you got to read the room.
Unfortunately. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you want to find me over at assemblycall.com, my film room stuff is within our community there. I post a bunch of stuff on Twitter as well at Coach Adragna. Yes, my username is at Coach Adragna. I don't currently coach. You can let me know that as much as you'd like to. That I'm not actually a coach. I'm just a Monday morning quarterback. But no, in all seriousness, love chatting IU hoops with folks. So if you ever have questions or anything, feel free to shoot them my way. Always a pleasure chatting IU hoops.
Always good to have you on, Tony. Thanks for the time. Really appreciate it. As for podcast on the brink, I think we're going to be back early next week with a mailbag episode. So I've already kind of reached out for some questions in our community over at Inside the Hall, and there's no shortage of questions. So we'll have a lot to discuss, and it'll also be the day after the Northwestern game, which is coming up on Sunday. Should be interesting. Indiana with two opportunities to kind of get back on the positive side of things, coming up at home with Northwestern, who is going to be without Ty Berry for the rest of the season, and then Nebraska, who I believe is winless on the road in Big Ten play, is coming to town on Wednesday. So two opportunities there for the Hoosiers. If you enjoy the show, as always, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, or leave us a rating over on Spotify. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.